We've treated domestic violence as a private issue. What happens behind closed doors, it's a private issue. When it's not, it has like lifelong lasting effects from children to adults to our hospital systems, legal systems. You're talking billions and billions of dollars if you want to put like a value on it. But it's not a private issue. And we shouldn't be afraid to talk about it. The same thing with mental health. Mental health is a huge issue throughout the world, but really in this country. And we have to normalize those conversations. And when we're talking about these things, also talking about ourselves and taking self-reflection for ourselves. And if we're responding a certain way, if we're coming across as compassion fatigue, maybe we need to do some time to do some self-assessment too on ourselves and say, hey, let me take a step back. Because believe it or not, like what we're exposed to in this job, the same way mental and physical abuse reprograms the brain of a victim, our brain is getting reprogrammed too as well, the circuitry in there. And we can fix it, but we just have to recognize it and work on it. And I think kind of tying all that together and realizing like empathy is the key in all this.
All right. Welcome back to the Safety Gap podcast, everyone. Today, I am super excited because we're doing a little bit of a crossover episode. And I get to introduce the co-host today, covering for our friend Cassidy, who was not able to be here with us, Ricardo Martinez. He is the brilliant voice behind Within the Trenches podcast. And so today we're coming together with a very special guest. So with that, Ricardo, we'll let you kick it off.
Yeah, thank you very much. This was just a couple days ago. We heard that this was going to be happening, and the podcast, that is, this episode that you guys are going to be doing, you and Cassidy. Cassidy is out. You guys had asked, let's do a crossover. Can we do this? And I said, yeah, put me in, coach. Yeah, let's do this. So I will say though, I've been just a little nervous because I feel like I'm asking my parents for the keys to the car for the first time. In a way. But
We're
I'm
asking you to drive.
That's right. But I'm excited to be here with you, and of course, the partnership that we have between Rapid SOS as well as Within the Trenches podcast. So this is an excellent way to do this crossover, and also just excited for this episode in general, especially because of the fact that we are now in October, and since 1981, this month has been National Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So again, just an honor to have our guest here today, not just to talk about what he and the family and the Gabby Petito Foundation are doing together, but also to, kind of talk about the story and his daughter, Gabby, but also to find out more about Jim. So with that said, our guest today here is Jim Schmidt. He is the father of Gabby Petito, as well as the secretary of the Gabby Petito Foundation. So let's welcome Jim.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for being here.
Yeah, I'm excited.
We've been talking a little bit, actually, before we got started here with this episode, and just kind of going back and forth. And like I mentioned, this month, what this month means and everything. But before we get into all of this, and again, thank you for joining us here on The Safety Gap. But before we get into everything that we're going to be talking about today, we kind of want to learn a little bit more about yourself, Jim, your journey as a first responder, because you've got about 20 plus years in public safety, correct? Not just as a firefighter, but also an instructor and emergency medical technician.
Yeah, actually, I started out in the volunteer world. That's actually where I met my wife. While I was going through fire and EMT school, I actually started in 911 dispatch. So I was working in 911 dispatch while I was a volunteer. And once I got my certifications, I quickly changed over and I got into career firefighting and EMS. But even as I was getting into that field, on my days off, I still work part-time per diem in smaller dispatch centers, mostly fire and EMS working. I always felt that time that I had in 911 dispatch really helped me become a better first responder, because when you're hearing things on the phone and on the other end and understanding what's going on in that room, I just think it gives you a better picture of what you're going to in the field, and allowed me to, be a better responder out there. So, my roots are started in 911 dispatch, and it's kind of grown from there, but I've never forgotten it. I always go back to that time there. I'm always appreciative. Throughout my career, I've always highlighted the great work and the important work that our dispatchers do each and every day. It's an extremely difficult job. They don't get credit for the amount of work that they do often. And, they deal with some unimaginable stuff and never know what the outcome is, but from that point, getting into the career aspect of it, I ended up finishing up as a career fire captain up in New York before, just as everything was happening with our daughter. A volunteer fire chief. I was a fire instructor. I went around, the Northeast working for third-party companies, doing a lot of technical rescue training, rope rescue, confined space, firefighter survival, different aspects of that part of training. And I enjoy every piece of being a first responder and helping people. And then once things happened and we lost our daughter, I realized it was probably time to hang up being on the street. And I had a job offer down here in Florida, and I kind of switched to a more administrative role where I was working in public relations, public education, risk reduction, things like that. And I officially hung up my coat after 25 years this past July, and now I'm on a different mission in life.
25 years. That is a lot of, thank you for your service and everything, that you've done. And I love how you mention dispatch and how everything starts there. You go back to that time as well. And Karen, maybe you can, attest to this as well. I almost feel like, a lot of times people say that musicians, if you know how to play like the piano, you can kind of do anything. And I feel like, and Jim, as well, as you were mentioning, with dispatch starting there, you kind of get that roundabout and you can go from there. What do you think, Karen?
No, I think there's a lot of opportunities for folks that do start in dispatch, and we want them to stay there too. And for those that, want to branch out a little bit, there's so many opportunities, and it just gives you awareness. It gives you critical thinking and problem solving skills, and these really skills that can go across any part of your life, from career to personal as well. It's having that awareness, that instinct, the curiosity, and the people skills also that set you up for success in so many things. And, you're an innate helper. And when you have that like flowing through your blood and you go wherever in business, relationships are key, and those people skills. So I love that, you spent a career helping people, and now you're taking this to the next level and helping in so many more ways, continuing that service. So again, thank you for your help. And it's really hard that it's a tragedy that drove to this next level. However, you're helping so many people that may not have ever had awareness before. So I know we're going to get into that story a bit as well.
Right. Yeah, that's a good, good segue going into now what we're going to be talking about in how your life, your mission, family, just everyone has been changed by what had happened with the loss of Gabby. So in your own time, however you want to put it, and please take your time as well, if you can share kind of the story, but also how you and your family decided to channel this whole situation into creating the Gabby Petito Foundation and what you're doing now, going to that next level, just as Karen said.
I just had an article that was published the other day to kick off Domestic Violence Awareness Month in the Journal of EMS magazine, where I kind of laid a lot of that out. And doing this job for so long, you do see the unimaginable. Sometimes you do experience tragedy, and you power through those things, and you sometimes see the worst in the world. But you're doing it for the greater good. And you often think that even though you see these things, that you personally and your family are impervious to these tragedies. And I would say that was probably my biggest mistake going into it, not realizing, hey, this thing can happen to anybody. And I couldn't really tell you much about domestic violence other than what you would see on TV, or, what people's preconceived notions are. And so, when your kids grow up, you do everything you can to raise them, keep them safe, and guide them the right way. And for Gabby, I came into her life when she was 2 years old. So I was really there for a huge part of her life. And then seeing her becoming an adult was an amazing thing. It's something we're really proud of. And, when she was starting to travel and do her thing, it was a great thing to watch. And, there was little issues, like I think in any relationship along the line, but, on the surface, when you look at them individually, those little red flags were very benign to us. They seemed like, maybe they're just slight relationship issues. And then suddenly, you're thrust into this spotlight because your daughter's missing. The fiance returned home with the van. We were like, we got to find our daughter. My wife started a Facebook page to say, like, help find Gabby. And we had no idea that it was really going to explode and take off the way it did. There's a lot of speculation on why it did, slow news cycles, missing white woman syndrome, where people that look a certain way get more attention, which these are all absolutely real things that happen. And for us at that moment, our concern was just finding our daughter. And I know for myself, that 20 plus years of doing what I did, in that moment, I didn't know how to go into a dad mode. I didn't understand that. My first responder brain kicked in. It was like somebody tripped the tones in the station and like, we got to run and like, we got to do it to it. And so, that's when I kind of turned around. This looked like it was really covering the entire country. We were living in New York at the time. Gabby's father and bonus mom were down in Florida. That's where they had just moved within the last year. Gabby's on this cross-country road trip, and we knew that she was probably in the Wyoming area. And I said, I'm going to go find her. I'm going to bring her home. And I said, I've got search and rescue experience. I can speak law enforcement, by working with them. I don't know what we're going to find, but I'm going to find her and I'm going to bring her home. And that's what I did. I went out there and, the media really kind of took over. It just exploded with so much stuff. We're finding things out like real time, like everybody else. It wasn't like we had any insight to some of the things and information that was coming out. And then on September 19th, 4 years ago, that's when they had found her. The Teton County Search and Rescue Team with the Teton County Sheriff's Office had located her. And, it was a devastating day. You don't ever expect to bury your children. That's not how life is supposed to work, even though I've seen that type of tragedy, in other ways in other people's lives, but you never think it's going to happen to you. And on that day, I positively identified her body. Terrible. You shouldn't have to see that. There was many reasons why. I get a lot of questions why. And there was another person missing out there that closely fit her description. And so I had to be certain before I made the phone call home. And I did. I remember every waking moment of that day. There's a lot I don't remember with PTSD and neurobiology of trauma, how it really affects us. A lot I don't remember, but I can tell you every moment of that day. And I just remember after that being left with so many unanswered questions. And, it just really kind of grew after that. And then as time went on, we realized that Gabby's story really captivated, the world for that matter and touched so many lives. And we started receiving so many messages from people that, here you have this person who lived her life on social media, like so many people. You had audio, you had video, you had pictures. What seems to be picture perfect was far from it. And then in the end result was her murder. And I think some people started recognizing these similarities in their own relationships and were saying that because of her, they were able to get out safely. They were experiencing abuse. And so what do we do with that as a family? We're a family of helpers. I met my wife as an EMT, and so we said, we're going to start a foundation. And we didn't know how that looked like in the beginning. We were kind of finding our way, and it kind of keeps growing as it goes along, but we couldn't sit back and not help people. The world gave Gabby a platform. Her story touches so many areas of domestic violence. And as we went on, I look back in my career and I realized I never really had any training in this. It was in my EMT textbook. I responded to these calls and I unintentionally had failed victims in the past by not knowing how to respond, not knowing how to provide resources, how to use trauma-informed care towards them and how to help them start that safety planning process to give them hope that there's a chance that they can get out. And so that's kind of how the foundation grew from that point, between education and prevention and supporting other like-minded agencies.
Thank you very much for sharing that right off the bat. And as always, condolences just for all of it and, for Gabby and just this whole situation. I remember myself watching this as this was going on. And I can't even imagine for you and your wife, Nicole, but in my head, just, sometimes I ask folks that I talk to, how do you feel that the profession, 911 has changed you. And there's always things that, we're kind of thinking, right, or in the back of our minds and such. So, with that said, for the both of you coming from public safety, and those, decades of experience and all, how did that either help or hinder or just simply shape your family's response or approach, that is, navigating this crisis and interacting with all these agencies that were involved and, news outlets and social media? How did that work out?
And that's a great point. And I talk about this a lot, that when I packed my bags and my gear to head out there, unbeknownst to me, I packed like 20 plus years of vicarious trauma that I didn't know I carried, that I didn't know was weighing on me. And I thought that all of those experiences had prepared me for anything in the world. And I can tell you that when I was out there, and I was interacting with law enforcement, when we had the meetings and I was talking with them, I was laser focused. I was in the zone as a first responder. But none of that stuff, that none of the training, none of the experiences I ever had ever prepared me for that moment on September 19th. And it really hit me hard. It really started to call a lot of things into question. Like I felt like I had this, proverbial shield of armor that protected me from that stuff, and I would just be able to move on. And I realized quickly that I couldn't. That nothing had prepared me for that moment. And in a way, it was almost selfish of me to think that it could. Would I change certain things going back? You always look back and say things are, hindsight's 2020. But as far as going out there and providing the information and doing what I could, like I wouldn't change that. Like, and I wouldn't want anybody else in our family to experience what I absorbed that day. But my training and my experience helped me in the moment until that moment came. If that makes sense.
Karen, I'll go to you here really quick, just on the back end of that. Sometimes when we're just as an example, we'd be calling 911 and our minds right away go into first responder mode, not just parent mode. And you start giving all of those answers to all the questions that are going to be asked. And we have to step back for a moment and try to think, wait, hold on, they need to do what they're doing. And I need to, play the part of the parent. Like, have you ever had that moment, or, just kind of thought about that in general? Like sometimes we do that because that's how we come from the profession. And we need to kind of, like Jim was saying, had to step back and kind of take off that armor a little bit.
Yeah, I agree with Jim, and that's the hardest thing to do, because you know what you're doing. You are a professional responder. You know exactly how to interact and talk, as you said. And I think we've also trained ourselves to disconnect from those people that we're helping. Like, we're still a human, right, Jim? But we're not going to build a relationship with them because we need to move on to the next thing. And I don't need that to come too close to me. It's impossible to try to separate that when this is your baby. Might get a little bit emotional about that, but have I had an experience calling 911 and having to take a different role? Yes, it was a very different situation. My daughter was choking on a cashew and her lips were starting to turn purple. And in that moment, there was panic all around. My step there was like, make somebody else call 911, because that's going to calm them down and let me try to save her. But I just, the unimaginable is playing both roles and not being able to disconnect and walk away and separate yourself from that person. And cannot imagine, Jim.
Yeah. And when I went out there too, I made sure to tell them, like, I'm here as a parent. Like, I'm not here to interfere, but, just know, being in this job for as long as you are, you develop friendships and relationships and connections with people all across the country. So my phone was lighting up with, like, hey, my incident management team is just clearing from a fire in, Idaho or wherever it was at the time. Like, say the word, these guys are going to pack their bags. They're going to come help you and be boots on the ground. And it was like, guys, let's appreciate that. I'll keep you in check. I'm going to let them do what they got to do, because I knew, potentially, that could cause more issue. So, I did have that mindset to have that separation in the moment.
You mentioned earlier that as you were getting through all of this, you kind of reflected on some of the training that you may not have had earlier on, or, some things that you may have missed on calls that you might have gone out to. So with that said, as we're kind of thinking about, training and response and everything, for that matter, just from that perspective, what do you think is the most significant safety gap in police, fire, EMS? And Karen, I'll go to you for the dispatch piece here in a moment, but how people are currently trained to identify and respond to some of those often subtle signs of domestic violence or abuse.
So first and foremost, I think we're still very siloed
Mhm.
in this profession and in a lot of places around the world. And when it comes to domestic violence, it really takes a coordinated response. And we got to break down those silos, break down those barriers, and everybody needs to be sitting at the table together. Because if we're not all working together, we're not all receiving the same training and understanding the dynamics of the situation, there's going to be inherently a gap there. And it only takes one bad experience along the way for somebody who is very hesitant to start to even call 911 to believe that there's hope for them to get out safely. And I always say that starts at 911 dispatch, and they need to be at the table and they need to understand, like, what are they hearing, like listening beyond the call, keeping that historical data on the address. Because just because, a person may be arrested for a perpetrator for abuse doesn't mean they're going to be convicted of it. But we're always going to have that call log, right? We've been there so many times, right? And identifying that. That's not only, trying to get as much information as possible in a trauma-informed way and starting that trauma-informed process right from the beginning and providing them hope. And there's tons of great examples out there. There was just one out of Nashville, Tennessee from their dispatch center. Ironically, the dispatcher's name was Gabby. She did a phenomenal job through text 911. There was just another one out of Ada County, I believe in Idaho, with a sheriff's dispatcher out there through, I think it was a non-emergency call. Like, they started that trauma-informed process because they were listening and hearing beyond the call that there was something more going on. And then that goes right into law enforcement and fire and EMS to know and identify scene clues, what's going on. And I think the biggest thing that we're missing is really the trauma-informed way why that person who's experiencing that abuse is behaving the way they are, why they may come off as not being truthful or not being credible or can't remember things or recanting all the time, and why they're in that space, and all working together along the way. I always tell people the one thing, like, you can provide like the top-notch, like best care, life-saving care, whatever it is, save somebody's life. But if you treated them like garbage while you were doing it, they're never going to remember, that positive outcome. They're going to always remember, but they were terrible to me. They were mean to me. And that interaction is really important. And everybody needs to have that. Let's take a step back. I know these calls are sometimes frustrating. We get a lot of them. Let's take a breath and look at the big picture here. And I gotta put my trauma informed hat on. And I think that's huge. And we all need to be sitting at the table. That way it's just continuous all the way through.
I agree fully that there's a lot of different things that go through, just starting from the phone. And Karen, I want to go to you on this part for the dispatch side of it, because I know a lot of times there are classes, right? There are classes that people give and everything, but I think for you and I, starting when we started many moons ago, it was mostly going on our gut feeling, on our instinct, listening and hearing something and thinking something's not right here.
Mhm.
You need to send someone out again, or you need to do this or that. It was a lot of us listening and having those feelings. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. Back in the day, in the, olden days, as you say, there wasn't a lot of information available. You were taught to be curious and you were taught to, use those gut instincts that drive you. And then there's times that you have those gut instincts, you can't really provide data behind it. Are the people that you're relaying this information to going to believe you and take that for factual value, right? And I love what you say about breaking down the silos, because now there is a lot of training available. And I think in every academy, there's likely a domestic violence course. And there are other courses that are being offered to those that wear a badge, whether it's law enforcement, fire, potentially, that may go a little bit deeper, but dispatch isn't getting those either. So it kind of feels like, you get some information, but not all, and bringing everybody to the same playing field, right? And the same level of education, awareness, and understanding can give all of the perspectives of, well, here's what you're training and teaching, but here's what we experience on the phone. So how can I better ask questions, dive deeper, listen more intently, And how can I relay that information more accurately to those out in the field? And I think there's still so much opportunity to bring all of that together. Now, your dispatchers are probably the best crime analysts because they do follow those patterns and they understand this person's called 50 times. And yes, it needs to be logged in CAD as well. This is a problem. It may not always get flagged at a really high level to responders. And then we kind of have this feeling, Ricardo, of I gave all this information out and now I no longer have control of what that outcome is going to be. And that is a very stressful place to live.
Yeah, for sure. And I think one of the things too that sometimes we can rely on is just past experience. I always talk about with folks that there are just experiences that we've gone through that can maybe help us with specific calls. And just for example, really quick before we move on here to the next portion, is I had a trainee, and it was a potential domestic violence call that was going on, but the phone, you could just hear what was going on in the background. And right when the person hung up, and I'm listening on the other end as my trainee is taking this call, I heard a pulse. And my trainee went to hang up, and I said, no, don't hang up yet. And she's just looking at me, and I said, don't hang up. I said, this person is going to pick up the phone and they're going to try to call again. And a few seconds later, they did. And I told my trainee, go, like, now, say something. And then we got people out there. It ended up, being okay. But there was a, domestic violence situation that was going on there. And after all of it was said and done, my trainee looks at me and says, how did you know? How did you know that that was going to happen? And I said, well, first off, I'm old. Okay. So I remember what it means to hear a pulse, that if you, at one time, for those who are watching and listening who might not know, when there was a pulse before touch tone, dial tone, which makes me sound that much older, if you had one line open or the line open and someone hung up, but you had the other line open still, the call is still open. So that's how I knew that, because as a kid, we used to kind of play on the phone and we would keep that line open. So that's how I knew. So there's also experience, things that we go through along with the further training that can help us out in situations like this. So with that said, Jim, with your experience and being out there in the field as well on certain calls, how tough is it in those quick moments when you're out there, when something is going on, to be able to detect or assess what is going on, to hear some of those key things, to know whether there is some sort of, dangerous form of abuse going on, or just something further than what you see?
I think, looking back on it, it's all like being in the right mindset and how we're framing it and framing our training. And, especially from an EMS standpoint, the very first thing, if we're going through a protocol, it's like, scene safety. Is the scene safe? Do we have our gloves on? Yes, we do. Now we can proceed. But like really thinking about that and really kind of being perceptive of what's going on around you, because just because you respond to this call and it doesn't come across as a violence in progress or however, an assault call, however it's going to be coded, it may come in differently, when it doesn't really get fit into any of the groups, we'll dump it into that sick call protocol or something like that, which can be the gamut of anything. But when you pull up and you're there and you're just kind of looking around and you're keying in on certain things, when you're looking at, in this instance, I would say my patient, is their story lining up to what they're telling me? Are there patterns of injuries that they're reporting consistent with what you see, the mechanism of injury? Is the patient at that point hesitant to speak? Are they looking at somebody else in the room before they answer? Is somebody answering for them? Are you being denied entry right off the bat? Oh, it was a mistake. We didn't call you, and you kind of know the address. Like picking up on those dynamics, even like children in the room, like, are you seeing children and what do their faces look like? And again, I think it goes back to a lot of what you're saying with that experience and sometimes that gut instinct where like, something's not right here. And, where I came from in New York, we were very lucky where the police responded on every EMS run. They were all certified EMTs coming out of the academy. And a lot of times they would get on scene first. So we would usually always have law enforcement unless they were delayed. Not everybody has that. But if you're recognizing those signs and they're not right and law enforcement's not there, that might be the time to say, hey, something's not right here. Something is off. And what I always tell folks too is nowadays everybody's walking around with a radio, right? Like everybody's issued a radio. I know dispatchers love that when everybody has a radio now, right? So, but is the PA on the ambulance, and I'm going to be like, hey, we have a potential domestic violence incident here, and it's blasting over everybody's radio, it's blasting over the PA on the ambulance, and now the potential perpetrators hearing what I'm saying. That might be a time to say, you know what? Let me pick up the phone and call in the dispatch and be like, hey, I need you to keep this off the air, but something's not right here. We're safe, we're good, but we need law enforcement here as soon as we can. And like picking up on those scene cues. And I'll always tell my EMS folks out there, like, if you can, like, where's your safe place? Like hey, we want to check you out a little bit further, but in order for us to do that, we're going to bring you to the back of the ambulance, your environment where you can control. And at any point, if it starts to get like, something's not right here, it's like your safety, like, time to go. And just really keying in on those things, I think is huge, like picking up on that.
It makes me think of slightly, not exactly the same, but it kind of makes me think of the dispatch here, where, we are listening to every single thing that's going on. One ear is listening to inside the room and the dispatch center, that is, and then the other ear on the call, you're listening not just to the caller, but the entire environment. Any little bits of sound, anything like that is going on, for us to, as we're saying, with that gut feeling, to be able to go further and say, look, this is what I'm hearing as well. We need to, either you need to step it up or just, type it in the narrative and go from there. So there's a lot of different ways. And I love how you put what it's like being out there, because for Karen and I, like, we don't know. We only know what people tell us. And so moving from there, because I kind of want to talk about as well, for the foundation, the type of training that you are doing. But before we get to that part, I want to ask Karen here really quick, because Karen and I were both at the Be the Difference conference where, Jim, you and Nicole were, and you spoke. And I just want to ask Karen here really quick, for that time where they were speaking, and just how was that for you? Because I know for me, sitting there listening, and I was sitting up front, and which I had to turn my head a few times, because seeing the both of you speak, I'm the type of person that if I see people get emotional, I get emotional as well. So I kind of turned a little bit, but it was just so powerful to be there and just to hear everything. So Karen, I just kind of wanted to hear what your thoughts were on that as well.
It was very emotional. From a former 911 perspective as well, in those calls that you've taken, that, they never leave you. And so many times you wonder, and very few, that you were there to help somebody on that day. And then I'm a mom. I have a daughter. And this is where I will start to get emotional, because you start to think, as a parent, these are things that no parent should ever have to experience. And sitting in the audience, I watched some of the videos, and I was listening to you both, but when Nicole stepped out of the room for a particular part of the video, I actually left the room as well. And I went and just spent a little bit of time with her, because I can also imagine, I don't know that I would want to be alone during such an emotional time, you can kind of hear things from the other side of the wall. And I just got to have a little bit of one-on-one time with her. And I think maybe that was just me escaping, because I probably couldn't have sat through that whole thing. I watched on social media. I watched on the news channels. I followed this story every single day, every moment, every action, never, ever thinking I would meet you all. And I thank you for being here and sharing your story. The work that you're doing is so important, because it's going to help young girls like my daughter, like my family members, like my friends, my nieces. And so just thank you. That it was very impactful.
But thank you. And thank you for that. And thank you for going out there with her. I know it meant a lot to her. There's some days we can power through that stuff. And then there's some days it's like, even myself, like I'll to this day play some of those same videos, and I'm like, I'm going to step out of the room for a moment, but I know when to come back in. And I think especially mom to mom, being with her that day, that meant a lot to her. So thank you.
And that's why I wanted to bring this up as well, because that's the type of impact. That's the power of Gabby's story, the entire story, everything that you're doing, you being here, talking with us and sharing this. So with that said, for the Gabby Petito Foundation, you're focused on bridging this gap that we've been talking about. So what are some of the that you can tell us, some of the training programs that are being developed, or just your approach, or a different approach to the standard of training as it is now?
Yeah. I mean, and we have a board and we have volunteers now. It's still, the four parents are the core of the foundation, and each one of us really has, our own area of expertise. Joe, Gabby's father, he spends a lot of time with legislative stuff, and I'm like, God bless you, because I don't want any part of that. And he's really amazing at it, and he has the ability to get people on the phone. When we were looking at this domestic violence world and starting to educate ourselves a lot more on it. I look at it personally for myself, where I had a career for 20 plus years where I never liked to come across something where I didn't know what to do or who to call. And yet I responded to these calls, and I just remember going back to like one of my first partners on the ambulance who was like, calls for violence. The only thing you got to know is the winner goes with the cops. The loser goes in the back of the ambulance. It's not for us to figure out. Stay safe. Don't get hurt. Okay. That's what I kind of went by it. And so I really kicked myself in the butt for saying, well, you responded to these calls, but you never gave it a second thought on like, maybe you could be doing more, even if you're not getting them to the hospital. And so looking at it, like, we're a very reactive society in general. Like, your house is on fire, call 911. You're having a medical emergency, call 911. You're in an abusive relationship, call a shelter, and all of those reactive services are very, very much needed. We need to have those reactive services, but let's start being a little bit proactive. And how do we start reducing the need for those services? And I think this can really apply across the whole first responder world, as well as trickling into a lot of other places in life. And it's prevention and education. So if we can start doing more prevention and education, maybe we can reduce the demand on those services by educating ourselves. For Tara and Nikki, the moms, they do a lot of stuff with like teen dating violence. They'll do a lot of talks in colleges. They're starting to get into more and more high schools. And they're really awesome in that forum and doing that work. Me doing this, I wasn't sure how I would fit into the DV world. And then I'm like, let me search for some training out there. And it's very, like everything else in our world, very fragmented depending on where you go. Some have more, some have less, some have nothing. And so I'm like, all right, let me see what I can do. And as I went on, I started building out a couple of programs. The very first one I built out is something I call Powerful Partnerships. And it's for domestic violence agencies on learning about the fire, EMS, and 911 world, knowing what our world looks like, who we are, what our certifications are, what standard operating procedures we operate under, how we learn, how to approach us, how to be mindful of our time, and how to interact to get us to the table. Because they want to do the training with us, but they struggle making that interaction. And then the next one is getting out into the 911 world. And I developed a program. It's called Unseen Advocates, the vital role of first responders in domestic violence response. And it really starts, depending on my crowd, it could go from 911 dispatch, fire, EMS, even law enforcement in there, hospital staff, trying to get all of those pieces in the room. I try to always get the local domestic violence agency in the room as well. And really kind of going from like, beginning to end, like what this should look like, what to expect when they call 911, how we can start that process there, a whole DV 101, non-physical versus physical forms of abuse. And then I take that all the way on to scene safety, documentation, how to provide resources quietly and safely if they don't want to be transported, and even get into topics like non-fatal strangulation, which is very serious. And that's obviously how our daughter was taken. And so I really started to dig pretty deep into that topic and realizing just how dangerous people who strangle are. I mean, when you talk about who kills law enforcement in the line of duty, like 50% of the perpetrators who kill cops in the line of duty have a documented history of strangulation. And, it's really considered the perfect crime because less than 50% of the people have any external mark. And yet there can be this whole manner of underlying health and medical conditions that can be fatal if that person's not treated. And so educating our dispatchers to try to recognize those signs, not only to get the right resources there to respond, but also knowing that they are dangerous to first responders, that those people who strangle on scene, getting those flagged in the notes so law enforcement knows, like, hey, like this is potentially like even more worse than normal. And then our responders recognizing it on scene, even if they're walking, talking, they're ambulatory, it doesn't mean that there's not something more serious underneath, and kind of bridging those gaps, bringing all those folks together. And then what does that transition look like once we get into the ER? And so when I first started doing it, I felt like, I was doing like an hour training, a 2-hour training. Now I'm up to like 4 and 8 hours on this. And I'm like, I don't even know if 4 and 8 hours is enough. I could probably do a whole week on it. And so just trying to get out there in front of like a whole multidisciplined audience and spreading that information.
As you were building all of this out, did you have or experience any of those aha moments? Because again, just going back to the beginning of this, when you were talking about as you were just kind of going through this and seeing or realizing like, oh man, maybe I missed some of these things, and I could have said some of these things, way back when, I was going out there in the field to these different calls, and also building out some of these, especially dispatch wise and such. But more so for those out in the field, were there any of those aha moments that you just kind of didn't expect?
I've woken up quite a few times in the middle of the night going, oh my God, I unintentionally failed that person. I missed that. Oh my God, like looking back on it now, there's always this one call that I remember, and I'm not going to go too much into it, but she would call frequently, and unbeknownst to us at the time, because we didn't really dig deep into it, we just wrote it off as a mental health crisis, substance abuse issue. We knew when she was going to call, and that was it. Okay, we're going to transport her again today, until the last time, and that was when her ex took her life. And so, I didn't give that much thought until, just about a year and a half or so ago. After going through the deposition, I woke up in the middle of the night sweating bullets. And I'm like, oh my God, we failed her so bad. Like we had opportunities. We didn't even recognize it. And so I never go out there and say like, here I am on my soapbox. I was perfect. No, I unintentionally made mistakes. And, not only do I live with the devastation of losing my daughter to a tragedy, but I also know that, I probably negatively affected the lives of other people. And I don't want you to be in any one of those positions where I am right now at any point in your career. And this is why I'm out here today talking to you. And that's how I approach it. I never talk at them. I'm on their level. I'm very open about myself and, my mistakes. And listen, I can't change them, but we can learn from them and we can do better.
I commend you. And again, thank you for being on and just sharing all of this. And Karen, going to you here really quick, just listening to some of the stuff that Jim mentioned here, just in these last 5 minutes or so, were there any aha moments for you? Because like this whole strangulation piece, I didn't know that part.
No, I think, some of the training we've taken, it's been taught or ingrained in us that, well, if they, do bad things to animals, then they're likely to, but you don't really think about that strangulation piece. And maybe those aren't the questions that we used to ask about either. It was always focused on the, are they hitting, slapping, punching, open fist or open hand, closed fist sort of thing. And there is a lot of nuance in that. And those words really matter. And people aren't always likely to tell you everything that's happening. You got to find a way to draw that out.
Yeah.
And again, it's just critical work that you all are doing. And I'm curious too, is there legislation that you all are trying to work towards to support this initiative of getting training and awareness out?
We're doing it very carefully. Because, one of those curse words in our field is that word like mandate. That usually equals no funding. And, a lot of folks get their back up against the wall. And so right now it's really awareness and getting that information out there in their hands. And my goal is, as we start doing more and more of this training, that we start building out like a legitimate test bank of questions around domestic violence, strangulation, and starting to get that into like refresher programs, and then start building it into, the initial training programs and going from there. So I know I'm working with a lot of different people. We're looking at it from a lot of different angles, and we're trying to use that approach right now. But as I go on, like I keep thinking of, more and more things. And, when I'm talking to dispatchers and I'm like, when it comes to strangulation, sometimes they'll call it choking. They just choked me a little bit, even though we know it's not choking. Like, oh, we got to dig a little bit deeper. And then it's like, oh, wait, they got to go by a script. They're an accredited agency. If they start deviating from that, then that's risking other things. So now, do we get into our accreditation? What is it? Priority dispatch and all these other agencies that are out there, and start looking at that protocol and say, hey, let's bring in some experts on this. Maybe if they answer yes to this, just like you have these little subcategories, we can have these couple little questions that are really imperative that we ask, and it's for the safety of the person who's calling and also for the people responding, and looking at that aspect. And I think the other important thing, especially on the dispatch end, when you just mentioned some of those questions they told you to ask, like there's a reason why you ask that, because a lot of those are evidence-based questions, because depending on how they answer can determine what level of lethality that victim is potentially in that moment. And if you're asking those questions and law enforcement is trained in that evidence-based lethality, like it should be setting alarms off in their head when they're responding. So, there's all reasons on why we do it. It's like, let's tie it all together and let everybody know why versus, I got to go through the script.
As we're going kind of into the wrap up of this episode, which has been, again, phenomenal to have you on, and just have a few more questions for you. And I just want to jump into just kind of the technology piece. And what I mean by that is, as you know, Jim and Karen, from the time that we started, there wasn't really a lot, right, going on. But the way things have gone and have just multiplied all the way till now, Jim, how do you feel, or what do you think is needed when it comes to technology, or how do you think technology can impact either it be the response or how people react, I guess, more so to domestic violence, like how they can get the information faster? Like, how do you think that has come, and where do you see it in the future?
You bring up a really good point. And as you talk about technology, it just made me think of something, and I'm going to show my age a little bit. And I remember picking up a part-time shift in one of the fire departments that I was doing some dispatch work for. And I happened to walk in the door for the 3 to 11 shift. And the guy I relieved, I'm like, all right, how was your day? He was like, the famous word, quiet, nothing going on. He walked out the door, and like 15 minutes later, all the power just dropped out of the console. It was the day of the Northeast blackout.
Oh, wow.
And, and then the AC's off in the building, like nothing's working. They had to bring the rescue truck around and plug the generator into the firehouse to power up the console. The computers weren't working. Everything was on paper. And I'm like, man, if that was to happen today, like, would we be able to get through that? And so technology has really grown. And, sometimes in the DV world, there are some people resistant to technology-based solutions, but, and that's because of the ability of the abuser to access it. But it takes really good people on the back end to keep them out of it. And what I'm starting to see as I'm going across the country is, growing up in the New York tri-state area, we were rich with resources. I probably have more cops in my county than some of these places have in their entire state.
Mm-hmm.
And so technology-based solutions, like things like what Rapid SOS is doing, they're really important. And I think we're actually partnering with a company right now. We're trying to get it funded, but we do have technology-based solutions to do and provide resources to these victims in a very clandestine way to keep them safe, when they might not necessarily be able to drive to, a DV organization or go to a police station. And I think starting to move towards that more technology-based, I think even getting that same technology in the hands of our first responders, if they're on scene and they want to provide those resources, instead of handing them a piece of paper, which is not the best way, like, boom, I got something for you right here, and it's clandestine. I think that's really the wave of the future for getting, especially in our generation now. Like, I know for my son, like, tell him to pick up the phone and make a phone call. He's like, I'd rather text, or, like, is there an app for that, type of thing. And I think we need to be adapting to the way our culture is going, because if we don't, we're missing a whole segment of our population that we can be helping, or maybe apprehensive to reach out for help because for whatever reason. So I really look at technology as there's a lot of good things out there. For us, the things we're looking at, it's trying to get it funded.
I love that. And going to you really quick, Karen, before we go into these last few questions here, I mean, your thoughts as well on just the technology side and the things that we're able to do now where we couldn't do it before. And I think for a lot of us, and me as well, without some of this stuff, I remember going home and there was that thought of, I hope that person was okay. I hope they made it okay, or I hope they found them, or anything like that. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, we've come a long way and still have a long way to go. I think the location is the foundation of every emergency call. If I can't find you, I can't help you. So we are doing so much better at being able to provide that accurate, precise location through technology and tools, and super proud of the work that we get to do to support that. And then you kind of layer on other information. So we see a lot of our partners that have different types of devices for personal safety, whether it's a panic button or, through an app in a ride share or other services where, they can a little bit more discreetly request for help. But there also is checks and balances, a way to verify, validate that is an emergency as well. And I think that that's one layer of protection, because you need maybe various layers. If somebody can't speak on their own behalf, is there technology that can help speak for them? Well, first, location. And maybe they're putting things like in a safety profile at emergencyprofile.org, or in their device where you put your medical information. Maybe you put in there that, hey, I have an aggressor and here's information, or I have a protection order and here's who I have the protection order against, so that technology can feed the information for you to the field responders and through 911, because it's all about connecting that information and ensuring it goes out, Jim, as you mentioned, to all of the folks that are responding. And then how are we tracking that information afterwards and leveraging that data? I think, Jim, to your point of how do we provide education based on what is happening within our community and our organization, because sometimes there may be a little bit of nuance and uniqueness. I always have said too, like, not every domestic violence call or request for service is the same. They are like fingerprints. They're very unique, but you can see the patterns, the threads, and start to identify the level of incident. So I think technology has certainly come a long way. It's available to help. And maybe with AI, we're able to listen a little bit more on that call to say, okay, they're asking about pizza, but the context around why they're asking may indicate that this is not an accidental call for pizza, that there is something else going on.
So with that said, as we kind of look at also creating this culture of safety, Jim, what are some ways that instead of having this approach that seems like has maybe always been there of just reacting, how can we build this culture for those out in the field in your thoughts, your perspective of creating more of a proactive culture? But on top of that, kind of a two-parter here, what is some advice that you give to those out in the field with just all of this together, to whether to look out for different words, different keys, anything like that? What are your thoughts? What's your advice to that?
We said before, like, once we get, and this is the biggest thing, and I think in our world is you don't know what you don't know, but once you start to get a little bit of information, you're like, well, I want to know more and I want to be able to do better. And I'm going to say, like, continue to stick with that. And I should say, like, for myself, I'm not an expert. I'm a self-proclaimed nerd. Like, my head's in the books. I'm always reading things. And so, continuing to educate ourselves and continuing to grow with it as things change, even stalking. If you were to talk about stalking right now, people, you think it's just, some creepy person following you. But stalking has gone like far beyond that, so like understanding all of those dynamics, like how they use devices, phones, track your cars and all this other stuff. And I think it's always just like continuing to educate yourself, continuing to look out for things that are red flags, because, I don't have hair on my head anymore, but like I still have some on the back of my neck. And if you're getting like that hair kind of like sticking up, like your intuition is probably pretty correct. And you need to kind of dig a little bit deeper into that. And so I think that's the biggest thing. And when I do this training too, I also take a piece of my training and I wrap it around to mental health and normalizing certain conversations. We often think about, and we've treated domestic violence as a private issue. It happens behind closed doors. It's a private issue. When it's not, it has like lifelong lasting effects from children to adults to our hospital systems, legal systems, I mean, you're talking billions and billions of dollars if you want to put like a value on it, but it's not a private issue. And we shouldn't be afraid to talk about it. The same thing with mental health. Mental health is a huge issue throughout the world, but really in this country. And we have to normalize those conversations. And when we're talking about these things, like also talking about ourselves and taking self-reflection for ourselves. And if we're responding a certain way, if we're coming across as compassion fatigued, maybe we need to some time to do some self-assessment too on ourselves and say, hey, let me take a step back. Because believe it or not, like what we're exposed to in this job, the same way mental and physical abuse reprograms the brain of a victim, our brain is getting reprogrammed too as well, the circuitry in there. And we can fix it, but we just have to recognize it and work on it. And I think kind of tying all that together and realizing like empathy is the key in all this.
I love that. Yes. Empathy is definitely the key. And I think sometimes we forget about that. And I love that you said all of that. And on the flip side of it, for, let's say, the public, what is some advice or just some thoughts for the public in general, parents, friends, family members, things that they can or should be aware of? You mentioned teens, that Nicole and Gabby's bonus mom also, they're teaching these things as well to be aware of. So what are some of the things, if, as long as you feel comfortable, of course, on advice for the public, things to be aware of, or even the safest way to intervene and just offer some sort of support?
First and foremost, if you think it doesn't affect you or it's not happening around you, it is. It doesn't matter what walk of life you come from, what your socioeconomical status is, what your religious beliefs are. This affects everyone and anyone. And I was set to have a meeting with an organization up in Massachusetts a few weeks ago, and it was a little delayed. And it was because they couldn't even call it a teen dating violence incident in their schools because it occurred in the middle school with like 11-year-olds. That was a very serious issue that required this very big intervention. And so we're starting to see, kids, especially in the world of technology, right? Everybody's got their phones and we've got the world at our fingertips. Kids are being exposed to a lot more these days. The world is at their fingertips. And we have to start normalizing and having these tough conversations that we don't want to have, because if we're not having them with them, and they might be getting their information from elsewhere and it might not be the healthiest. And it really starts with like learning boundaries and talking about boundaries, at an early age. And, even in our friendships, not even in an intimate relationship, if you have a friend that makes you feel bad about yourself, consistently, like they're not a good friend, and that's not a good relationship. And we need to cut off those negative interactions in our life, but really having those talks about what healthy relationships look like, even though this person might be an amazing person, but are they really doubting on you or doting on you and love bombing you in the beginning? Sometimes it seems like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. That can lead to a red flag. Are they trying to isolate you from your friends and family? Which they shouldn't do. Do they want you to be their center of attention? They want you around all the time. That's another red flag. Are they tracking everywhere you go? Are they asking you for passwords to your social media accounts or share your location on Snapchat, Instagram, and all these other things now? Like these are all red flags. And that is the beginning of a controlling relationship. And that's the root of all domestic abuse and domestic violence. It's the one person trying to gain and maintain power and control over another. And they do it through these coercive tactics. And there might not be physical violence in every relationship, but it all starts with these coercive control tactics and using different, manipulation to control them. And then it gets into, gaslighting them and making them feel bad about themselves and making their whole sense of reality seem like it's not real. And so just having those conversations about that. And, if you do recognize that someone, your child, a friend is in that relationship, just know that as much as you want to just rip them out of it, like you can't. Sometimes when we do that, you push them farther away and then we get upset because, to the outside world, the most reasonable thing is for you to just leave. Well, it's not that simple. And so learning how to have those tough conversations, letting your children know that you're a safe person to come to, that if they're going to come to you with a problem, you're not going to be judgmental. You're going to listen, you're going to be open, you're going to be receptive, and you're going to be supportive, and you're going to help validate and then try to work through it. And I think that's really key. And I think it starts in our youth, and that continues as we get older.
Excellent information there. Just every single thing that you said. And again, it has been amazing to have you on here. The impact of, Gabby, her legacy, the foundation, everything that's going on. When you think about 5 to 10 years from now, what is the ultimate hope for the legacy of not just Gabby, but the foundation that bears her name?
Honestly, we're working every single day to be put out of business. Our goal is to end one homicide by domestic violence, but like so many others have before us and continue to do alongside of us, end domestic violence and intimate partner violence. And that's our goal, is to keep reducing those numbers if we can, because right now they're going in the wrong direction. Would really put us out of business. And I'll tell you, if I would be jumping for joy if that happens. And then, I'll find the next group of people that need help, and we'll work on that issue. But in the meantime, we're just going to keep pushing forward with what we're doing. We're going to continue to educate ourselves. We're going to continue to use Gabby's voice to help others until we can't help anymore. And that's really where we're going to be.
Thank you again. And Karen, any final thoughts here as we're going into this wrap up?
And our condolences for your loss. She is a light that is shining through you all now. And what is, I think, even so much more impressive and powerful is how you all have come together in a multifaceted approach that is touching all of these various groups to make full impact. And, it's going from top to the law enforcement community, EMS and fire and, DV communities, as well as our kids who are so impressionable and may not want to listen to mom and dad.
Yeah.
Right. But they're going to listen to somebody who comes in, who has had a personal impact, and show them the signs. And that is going to go with them for the rest of their lives. So thank you for the work that you're doing, because it is saving people's lives. You may not ever know about it, but you know that it is. So thank you for spending your time with us here at the Safety Gap Podcast.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate this. Anytime I can get in front of an audience and talk about this stuff, I mean, I think you can see my passion for it, our family's passion for it. We're grateful for the opportunity. And I'll leave you with this. This is a saying I used to have with my firefighters. I probably stole it from somebody. I just can't remember who. But it's build a team so strong, no one can tell who the leader is. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to build this collective team that we might not all be experts in everything, but we surround ourselves with really great people. And it's all for the greater good of helping people.
Thank you again very much. And for those who are watching and listening, how can people find out more about the foundation, the training that you guys are doing, whether it be a website or social media? Where can people find you?
You can go to GabbyPetitoFoundation.org. So that's GABBYPETITO Foundation.org. Check out our website. We have a lot of great resources on there for them to check out. We're also on social media, on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, I believe, and LinkedIn a little bit. So, we're always out there trying to post and put educational stuff out there. And I'd also like to say, too, that, somebody listening right now might be experiencing some type of abuse. And if you're in a DV situation, just know that you're not alone. There's people out there that are supporting you and willing to help you. The domestic violence hotline is 1-800-799-SAFE, or you can text the word START to 88788 and do a text chat as well and reach out for help, and they can link you to resources in your local area. So just know that is always an option for you. So I always like to throw that in there too.
Love it.
Perfect. Thank you. And Karen, thank you for the opportunity. And it was just an honor to be here with you, to be a part of the Safety Gap podcast, and as well to be here with Jim as well. Thank you very, very much. This was just a very impactful and powerful episode.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for stepping in as a co-host today and leading that, again, as you mentioned, impactful conversation. Maybe we'll see you again, Ricardo.
Yeah, for sure.
Podcast.
And just really quick, as we're wrapping this up here, as Jim said, If you or someone that you know are experiencing domestic violence, please call, as he said, 1-800-799-SAFE. That is 1-800-799-SAFE. Or you can go to thehotline.org for more resources. It can be found at GabbyPetitoFoundation.org under Find Help. And also, you're able to also donate directly to support the mission of the Gabby Petito Foundation on their website. And for the Safety Gap podcast, it can be heard on anywhere that you listen to your favorite podcasts. You can find the Safety Gap podcast there. And also, for more information, you can go to rapidsos.com. Have a good one, everyone.